So today in this lecture series, we're going to talk about the theories of personality and how it relates to your sense of self. We're going to talk about three theories just to give you a sense of the field. Now, of course, there are entire courses devoted to talking about personality theory, but in this course, we're just going to focus on trait theory, humanistic personality theory, and psychodynamic personality theory. Second, after this initial lecture, we're going to talk about the origin and resolution of what's known as the person-situation debate, which is what's more important, your personality or the situation you find yourself in at determining how you're going to react to a situation. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the causes and consequences of differences in personality. First, let's start by talking about a definition of personality. So personality generally is defined as all the attributes, behavioral, so the things that your motor actions, temperamental traits, so the things that you inherited early in life that determine how you behave, your emotional and also your cognitive traits that characterize you as a unique individual. Things that sort of come together to determine your behavior in particular situations that might make you different than how other people react or interpret situations. Personality theory often partially starts with understanding some of the early theories about personality. One of the most well-known theories about personality, it was suggested by Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud suggested the idea of psychodynamic theory. Sigmund Freud was only one of many individuals to suggest research around personality and how the forces within your brain help to shape how you were going to behave. Sigmund Freud helped to train Alfred Adler, Melanie Klein, and Anna Freud. Even though he trained these individuals, they did not all agree as to some of the nature of psychodynamic theory. Anna Freud and Freud actually had multiple disagreements with Freud, but oftentimes was his most staunch defender. Freud believed, taking from ideas around physics, that you moved mental energy between different parts of your mind, and that helped to determine some of the personality traits and some of the mental disorders, the neuroses that people would develop. So if you fail to move mental energy in appropriate directions, that may result in some neuroses. And in fact, Freud believed that aggressive and sexual motivations were the primary causes of human behavior. Interestingly enough, that's not surprising, right? Remember that Freud began his research in the 1880s and in Victorian Europe, right? It was thought that you should not talk about or really be open about sexuality or sexual motivations. In fact, women and men often were expected to be fully clothed, to not show a lot of skin. And in fact, Freud believed that was really covering up, society covering up the unconscious motivations for sex. But also during World War I and World War II, which Freud survived through parts of them. It's not surprising that as Freud was living in Europe and experiencing some of the most widespread causes of human destruction, that he would develop a theory that suggested that your aggressive impulses really were an inherent part of people's motivation. In fact, he called it the Thanatos drive, which is the desire of humans to kill each other. There were two major parts of Freud's theory that are relevant for personality. One is the three parts of the psyche, the id, the ego, and the superego. You might think of these like this cartoon here, where your id follows the pleasure principle. It's something that's inborn, Freud believed, that drives your behavior. It does what it wants. It's like your childhood desire to eat all the cookies or ice cream that you want. The consequences be damned. Whereas your superego on the other side is sort of your ego ideal. It sort of tries to live up to what society and culture tells you you're supposed to do in an ideal situation. You might think of these as the devil and the angel that are often depicted sometimes in cartoons, and that your ego sits in the middle, which is the cartoon character trying to decide whether to listen to the id, the devil, or the superego, the angel. And the ego, yourself, is really trying to balance those forces and decide what to do. It's not surprising that Freud's theory became so popular because, of course, this makes sense, right? This is idea that your id, which is your desire to go out and hang out with friends and blow off your test or studying, whereas your superego is telling you you have to study, you have to do more work, and your ego is the one that balances those needs to come to a decision about whether you can put in 30 minutes or an hour of studying and then go spend some time with your friends. So it has a certain level of inherent believability to it. In fact, actually, lots of research doesn't necessarily support this ideal. I mean, yes, there is some measure of impulse control, but your measure of impulse control is not just sort of idealized by your id or your superego, nor, as Freud believed, is your id really hidden in your unconscious. These are conscious processes. But one of the things that's critical to Freud's theory was that you have three layers of consciousness. You might think of these as, sometimes we think of them as an iceberg. So only the very tip of the iceberg is above the surface of the water. And Freud believed this was like your conscious. These are your ideas, thoughts of which you are aware. Whereas your preconscious is material that you can easily recall. You might think of this as your explicit memory that sometimes you can think about if you need to, but most of the time is below the surface of the water. Freud believed that a lot of your ego really fits within your conscious and preconscious, and your ego follows, right? Your ego is also yourself. Then there's your superego. Your superego partially is preconscious, but also unconscious, which is what sort of your moral guardian that tells you what to do. And there's your unconscious, which follows your id. This is well below the surface of your awareness. You're not consciously aware of it. And this is your unconscious urges and desires. Now, again, this does match up with what we talk about when we talk about explicit memory and conscious memory, but, and there may be some forms of unconscious or hidden memory, but recognize that one of the important parts of Freud's theory is that he believed these unconscious forces were driven by the id, and that these id forces were often sexual and aggressive in motivation. The desire to harm other people was a desire to harm yourself. The desire to have the Oedipus complex, which is the desire of men to be jealous of their father, to try to drive their father out, to have the attention of their mother. And Freud believed this was mainly a sexual impulse that was driving this sort of incestuous desire to be with your mother. What Freud believed was hidden in your id, which I realize nowadays we sort of reject, but Freud believed that this was something that was captured both in Greek drama and that also was an actual human motivation. Now, moving forward from Freud's early theories in the early 1900s, we in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, researchers started to understand that in fact there was more than just these really dark impulses like sex and violence. One of these I think is epitomized by humanistic personality theory. Humanistic personality theory, as suggested by Carl Rogers, suggests that people develop negative mental disorders like depression or anxiety because they fail to accept a positive view of themselves. That in fact that if people were living in a more supportive, unconditional, loving environment, that in fact they would be able to improve themselves and there would be less negative thoughts and feelings that might result in mental illness. Humanistic personality theory very much focuses on your potential for personal growth, for freedom, and really is focused on examining the whole person. Oftentimes, humanistic personality theorists did not follow Freud, who believed that there are these stage-like models that you pass through. Freud very much believed that you can get stuck in these early stage models and that it would take decades of therapy to work you through to these later stages of development, similar to Piaget's stages of cognitive development. But humanistic personality theorists like Carl Rogers believed, in fact, that these didn't fully encompass what was actually happening, that you couldn't distill down this holistic, complex, unique person into a simple stage, and that often ignored some of the most complex and interesting parts of human personality. But some of the things that came out of humanistic personality theory actually include ideas such as your self-concept. This is your perception of your abilities, your behavior, and your personality. And ideas such as self-esteem, which is your measure of sort of how accepted you are in the environment. It's your evaluation of your worth as determined by how you think other people think about you. When people are really young, we first start with very generic, general kinds of self-esteem, right? I'm a good or a bad person. Oftentimes when we talk about the use of punishment or reinforcement for children, one of the things that punishment does is it damages your general self-esteem, so children start to think of themselves as a bad person, whereas as you get older and your self-esteem starts to differentiate into different kinds. I'm really good at sports, I'm a really good friend, I'm really good at math, or I'm really good at spelling, then the effect of general self-esteem starts to become less pronounced. So in fact, one of the things that we would recommend is that you would avoid punishing your children when they're young, because that may have long-term damage to their self-esteem, and that as children get older, they start to develop these more complex kinds of self-esteem. As I'm sure you are aware, your self-esteem generally, when we look at it across your lifespan, it tends to drop in adolescence, but over time it actually increases. In fact, your highest level of self-esteem tends to be in your 80s and 90s. Something to think about as you get older. And we generally, right, we very much in our culture believe that self-esteem is good. Parents say that you're supposed to be self-confident and they want children to be confident. Often that is assumed to be associated with self-esteem, but in fact, not always is high self-esteem good. We've talked about kind of the role of narcissism, and in fact, that people who are highly narcissistic and high in self-esteem tend to underestimate the risks to themselves. They take more risks, they engage in more alcohol use, more drug use, and potentially more damaging behavior. In the most extreme form, like with narcissistic personality disorder, where they think so highly of themselves that they ignore their friends and social relationships, and in fact is harmful actually to their ability to even just function in a social environment. One of the things you might do to try to evaluate your own self-concept and your self-esteem is to write a short description about yourself. What do you think you're like? So you might write down a list of 10 or 15 words that describes you as a person. Take 30 seconds or a minute to do that. You can pause the video here. Next, you're going to generate 10 or 15 words that you think that your friends would use to describe you, or maybe your family. You can pause the video here to do that. Lastly, you're going to think about your self-concept in the future. So what is your idealized self? What are the 10 to 15 words you would use to describe yourself in 20 years or so? What do you want to be like? Then look at how those are similar. Do you think your friends describe you the same way that you describe yourself? Why do you think that is? Do you think that how you are now is the person you want to be in the future? My guess is that for many of you, that's not true, actually, that you have some changes you want to make in yourself to be better, right? Things you want to improve about yourself. So in fact, one of the things we know about humanistic personality theory is that it's focused on change, that in fact it is possible for you to become a better person, to improve yourself, to procrastinate less, to be less anxious, to be a better friend, to be less moody, to be less impulsive. That in fact there are some positive changes people can make over time, which is really what humanistic theory has brought to psychology as a field. One of the schools that actually does a lot of work with humanistic personality theory, humanistic theory in general, is Sonoma State actually. So if that's something that's of interest to you, that might be a school that you would look at for transfer. The third theory we're going to talk about in this first lecture is trait theory. Trait theory is probably the most well-studied theory out there. This suggests that there's a limited number of personality traits that everyone possesses. This was first really researched by Gordon Allport. Gordon Allport and colleagues looked at the dictionary of 18,000 words they generated, and they tried to distill those down into a limited set of traits. That was the first attempt to try to understand personality theory. Since that time, we have distilled those traits down to further and further. Now the most common model is the five-factor model. This says that in fact there are 5 personality traits that everybody possesses. These are usually measured by self-ratings. So what scores do you have on certain traits? You know, how high are you, how outgoing are you, how quiet are you, how friendly are you, how neurotic or stable is your emotional states. And every person then receives a score from 0 to 100 on each of those 5 traits. The five-factor model has been researched by a variety of groups, but in fact, Richard Block at UC Berkeley has done a lot of work around this. One of the things we've seen is that when we look across cultures, that we see lots of stability in those 5 factors. And when we look across species, interestingly enough, so chimpanzees, rhesus monkeys, humans, all tend to have some number of these traits. Now, they don't usually have all 5, but rhesus monkeys, for example, have 4 of these 5 traits that look very similar, right? There's this emotional reactivity or neuroticism. There's this level of sociability or outgoingness or extroversion. And then, in fact, that's true in bears, dogs, cats, turtles, even goldfish and honeybees have 2 of these traits. Some are more anxious than others, right? Some honeybees and some goldfish are more anxious than others, and some honeybees are more social than others, if you want to think about it that way. Lastly, we know, in fact, that your personality is stable across your lifespan. If you were the most outgoing 5-year-old in your kindergarten, you're probably going to be the most outgoing 55-year-old in your retirement community or in your when you get to that age. So trait theory right now has settled on this five-factor model that there is an openness to experience trait. People that are high in openness to experience tend to be open to new experiences. They want to try new languages. They want to travel to new places. They want to try new foods. People that are low in openness to experience like the same things I always get. They don't want to try new things because they don't want to be disappointed. They don't want to waste their time or their money or their energy on trying new things that they're not sure they're going to like. They tend to like things that are really stable and predictable. Neither one is good or bad. They're just different. Of course, most people tend to fall in the middle on these traits. So most people are not on the extreme ends, but I'm just giving you the examples of what the extremes are like. Please recognize that most people are somewhere in the middle here. People that are high in conscientiousness are dependable and dutiful. When they tell you they're going to be there on time, they're going to arrive. When you look at their notes are highly organized. They're the people that you ask what's going on and what's happening in a class because they're the ones that are always going to be on it and know what's going on. People that are low in conscientiousness, on the other hand, are forgetful. They walk into class without pens or papers or notepad. They don't remember when exams are. They're always late for events. This is the friend that you're never going to ask to take to a movie because you know they're going to flake on you at the last minute, or they're going to forget about it. Or these is the friend that you always tell them the movie starts at 5:30 when in fact it actually starts at 6 because you know they're going to be 30 minutes late no matter what. People that are high in extroversion tend to be outgoing, they're very energetic, they're very confident, whereas people that are low in extroversion, who are introverts, they tend to be very quiet, they're very shy. They're not antisocial, they still have friends, but they just have a smaller, more limited group of friends. They like that stable group of friends, whereas people that are extroverted like meeting new people. They have a very diffuse, very large, very spread out social network. People that are high in agreeableness, the A in ocean, the ocean model here. People that are high in agreeableness are friendly, they're very empathic, they're very sensitive to other people's feelings. This is a friend of yours who says they always want to be a therapist or they really want to help people. Whereas people that are low in agreeableness are angry and grumpy. They don't get along well with other people. They often are not very kind. They're not very empathic about other people's feelings. Lastly, the N in ocean is neuroticism. People that are high in neuroticism are impulsive and moody and tend to be depressed or anxious more. People that are low in neuroticism tend to be emotionally stable. They're not very impulsive. Their moods tend to be much more predictable.